Hello, welcome to Senior Pride. Today I am going to discuss how housing laws in Alberta and overall in Canada affect tenants. Now, please understand that I recognize that there are some situations in which tenants are the aggressors, and that certainly those who are renting have experienced some very difficult tenants. That being said, as someone who has been a tenant all my life, I am well aware that there are just as many issues on the side of tenants being violated and victimized by those who landlords and those who rent out to us. I'm going to focus not just on Canada, but specifically on Alberta. But I think these issues, they kind of cross throughout many countries, so they're certainly important. I am going to look at how landlord and tenant laws impact tenants. Again, I understand this is one-sided. I am not ignoring the reality of difficult tenants on landlords. I'm focusing this particular video on the issues that tenants face. There are residential tenancy laws in Canada, but they are primarily provincial in nature, and each province tends to enact legislation to regulate the rental housing market. In Alberta, we have the Residential Tenancy Act, or the RTA, and it governs the relationship between landlords and tenants, outlining rights and obligations. Although there is no federal overarching tenancy law, initiatives like the National Housing Strategy do influence housing policies nationwide. So first of all, let's focus on rent increases and affordability challenges in Alberta. This is a crucial area. There is no cap on the amount by which rent can be increased. The RTA only stipulates that rent cannot be increased more than once in a 365-day period for the same tenant. This lack of rent control can lead to significant and sudden rent hikes, making housing unaffordable for many renters. Common law does not allow a landlord to effectively evict by way of an unfairly large rent increase, but the absence of specific limits can still result in significant financial stress for tenants. What are the eviction processes and tenant vulnerability? The eviction process in Alberta allows landlords to terminate tenancies for various reasons, including substantial breaches of the rental agreement by the tenant. While landlords are required to provide at least 14 days notice for such termination, the definition of a quote-unquote substantial breach can be broad, potentially leading to misuse by landlords seeking to evict tenants without just cause. Tenants can dispute such notices, but the burden of proof often falls on the tenant, placing them in a very vulnerable position. There is this lack of rent control measures. Now, many provinces have rent control measures. Alberta does not. And that means that we are often victim of significant rent hikes, potentially leading to economic evictions where tenants are forced to leave due to the unaffordability. And this lack of regulation in this area disproportionately affects low-income tenants, exacerbating housing insecurity. Of course, we've all heard of rent evictions, and rent evictions are where a landlord evicts tenants under the pretense of conducting major renovations, and they have become a contentious issue in various parts of Canada, including Alberta. The RTA requires landlords to provide proper notice and compensation in certain cases. However, tenants may still find themselves displaced with limited recourse. The lack of stringent regulations against such practices can undermine a tenant's security of tenure. The Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service in Alberta provides a platform for resolving disputes between landlords and tenants. However, tenants may face challenges in navigating this system, including legal complexities, potential biases, and the financial burden of pursuing claims. These obstacles can deter tenants from seeking justice, effectively limiting their ability to challenge unfair treatment. And I have personal experience with this board. I had a landlord who did not heat the apartment. The heating system was damaged. He would not repair it. This was in the middle of an Edmonton winter. It went on for many months. I did take him to the board, and he sat there smiling while he was lying. Now, I did win some compensation, but the fact is he got away with a great deal, and I had to leave for my own physical safety because you don't want an unheated apartment in the middle of an Alberta winter. So there are issues with this, and it took a while. There is a huge impact on marginalized communities, and that includes low-income individuals and new immigrants who often bear the brunt of punitive tenancy laws. Instances of tenant abuse, such as harassment and intimidation by landlords, have been reported, with newcomers to Canada being particularly vulnerable. The power imbalance can lead to exploitation and housing instability. So I want to hit a case study that was not in Alberta, but kind of hits this issue. And it was the Heron Gate neighborhood in Ottawa. And it really does serve as an example of how legal frameworks can disadvantage tenants. This happened in 2018, the Timber Creek Asset Management evicted residents from 150 townhomes, citing structural problems. Critics describe this as one of the largest forced displacements in Canadian history, disproportionately affecting racial minorities and low-income families. The legal provisions allowed such mass evictions, highlighting gaps in tenant protection laws. There are some federal initiatives, however, they also have significant limitations. So the federal government's introduction of the Renters' Bill of Rights aims to address housing affordability and tenant protections. However, the division of responsibilities between federal and provincial governments poses challenges for implementation. Provinces have the authority to enact necessary legislation, and without their compliance, federal initiatives may have limited impact. What is our legal recourse? How are we empowered? Well, we do have avenues for legal recourse, such as filing complaints with Service Alberta, but the process can be daunting. Tenants may lack the resources or knowledge to effectively pursue claims, and the power imbalance between landlords and tenants can further hinder justice. Strengthening tenant advocacy groups and providing accessible legal support are essential steps toward empowering tenants. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, please hit subscribe and like. Please share with people who may be interested. Thank you. I'm going to compare Alberta's legislation to other provinces. So, for instance, in Ontario, they have the Ontario's Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing Act of 2020, and it introduced measures to address issues like rent evictions. Now, critics argue that such laws may still favor landlords, indicating a nationwide need for more robust tenant protections. And in Alberta, we don't have that protection. I'm going to make some recommendations for policy reform. One of them is implementing rent control measures, introducing caps on rents to increase increases to reduce economic evictions, strengthening eviction regulations, so clearly defining acceptable grounds for eviction and ensuring due process, enhancing dispute resolution services, so making services more friendly and accessible, combating rent evictions, enforcing stricter regulations to prevent landlords from using renovations to evict tenants, increasing support for legal aid and advocacy, allocating resources for tenant advocacy organizations and legal aid services, ensuring tenants have the knowledge and resources to challenge unlawful actions, introducing landlord licensing landlords and requiring adherence to strict standards could create accountability and reduce exploitative practices. However, it could also decrease access to housing, so it's pro and cons here. A federal provincial collaboration. The federal government could work closely with provincial governments to harmonize housing policies and ensure consistent tenant protections across the country. There are broader impacts of ineffective tenant protections, one being homelessness. When tenants are displaced due to economic evictions or unfair practices, homelessness rates rise. And in Alberta, the lack of rent control measures and insufficient affordable housing has exacerbated this issue. Economic inequality. Disproportionate rent increases and eviction practices are more likely to affect low-income households, widening the gap between socioeconomic classes. Mental health impacts. The fear of eviction or harassment by a landlord can lead to anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues for tenants. Community disruption. Displacements caused by rent evictions or large-scale evictions break apart communities, disrupt social networks, and further destabilize tenants. There is a historical and structural context to where this comes from. The colonial foundations of property laws in Canada, the Canadian legal system has historically prioritized property ownership, often at the expense of tenant rights. This emphasis on ownership perpetuates power imbalances in landlord-tenant relationships. Neoliberal housing policies. Over the past few decades, housing has increasingly been treated as a commodity rather than a basic human right. This shift has incentivized real estate speculation and reduced affordable housing stock, which leaves tenants vulnerable to market forces. There is an important role of housing advocacy movements. Over the last few years in Canada, these groups have called for stronger protections and housing reforms. They play a critical role in highlighting the systemic challenges faced by tenants and in pressuring governments to act. So examples include ACORN Canada, a national organization advocating for affordable housing, rent control, and tenant rights. In Toronto, in Ontario, there is the Parkdale Organized. This is a grassroots tenant group that successfully resisted rent increases and rent evictions in their community. Now, let's look at a specific issue, and this was Alberta's response to COVID-19. It highlighted the precariousness of tenant protections in Alberta. While the Alberta government introduced temporary eviction bans and rent freeze measures during the pandemic, these policies were short-lived. The rapid return to pre-pandemic regulations left many tenants vulnerable, underscoring the need for permanent reforms. It differs in rural versus urban areas. So, in urban centers like Calgary or here in Edmonton, skyrocketing rents and housing shortages amplify tenant struggles. In rural Alberta, tenants may face challenges like limited housing options and less awareness of their rights, making them more susceptible to exploitation. There are challenges for Indigenous tenants. They face unique challenges, including specific discrimination, limited access to affordable housing, and jurisdictional disputes on reserves that contribute to housing instability. The federal government's lack of enforcement on housing standards on reserves further exacerbates this issue, leaving many Indigenous tenants in substandard living conditions. There's also the issue of environmental sustainability. Some landlords neglect energy efficiency upgrades, leaving tenants to bear the burden of high utility bills. Laws that incentivize landlords to adopt green practices could address this issue while promoting long-term affordability for tenants. I'm going to do a bit of a comparison globally. So, for example, in Germany, tenants enjoy strong protections, including rent caps and indefinite lease agreements, which foster stability and affordability. In Sweden, national rent control policies ensure tenants are shielded from excessive rent increases, which contributes to lower housing insecurity rates. Although Alberta and Canada as a whole have established frameworks to regulate landlord-tenant relationships, there are significant gaps that remain, notably the lack of rent caps in Alberta. The ease at which tenants can be evicted and the limited accessibility of dispute resolution mechanisms all contribute to a system that can feel punitive toward tenants. Policymakers must prioritize tenant protections through comprehensive reforms. By addressing systemic inequities and empowering tenants, Canada and Alberta itself can move toward a housing framework that upholds the rights of all residents and ensures access to safe, affordable housing as a fundamental human right. And again, I want to recognize that there are landlords that are doing their best, and they are being affected by tenants who are abusing whatever legislation is available to them. This is quite notable in Ontario, for example. We've heard of several cases. I am not discounting what landlords go through. I am simply talking about it from the tenant's perspective. And I assure you, at some point, I will talk about it from the landlord's perspective. Both parties need better regulation, more clear-cut laws, and they need things like rent caps and an understanding of what is available. We also need better dispute resolution policies and access for both parties. And with that, I say, if you enjoyed this video, again, I ask you please to hit share, please to hit like, please to become a member of this site. And with that, I say, be senior is to be proud. Hugs.